Jumpstart Your DFIR Journey webinar series. This is session 2. This one, the topic is called Cyber Threats and Important Forensic Concepts. Like you've seen with the first one, if you were there, we wanted to get an introduction into threat landscape, and kind of digital forensics, what's incident response, what we're supposed to do, kind of set the baseline. Now I want to get a little bit more technical. And then we have another session 3 planned for next week, where we're going to get a look into more of the incident response, digital forensics, tools, application processes, labs, automation, like a lot of cool things that you can do in your own environments or in your enterprise environments to make these things that we are learning about right now even more effective and quicker and easier. So with that being said, we also, and this is really cool, we have a dedicated Discord channel for this series where people have already started to get the memes game going, and people are back, awesome, in the Discord channel. So if you want to join our Discord channel for discussions after this session, during this session, or sharing your best memes you have, feel free to join the DFIR Journey sessions. You can find it in the Blue Cape server, Discord server, on the bottom in the events category. There is a link, let me see, that you can see on the slides here. So tinyurl.com DFIR-Discord drops you right in there. Let's talk about why we are here, right? So one of the experiences I had in my days working in DFIR was it was kind of tricky to kind of gain experience, right? Without seeing crazy stuff on a daily basis, right? Attacks, working on exciting advanced threats, investigating those. It's hard to gain experience. So it's kind of tricky if because there's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of training, right? You can't just say, I go out, do this training, and then I can apply it in my own environment, because oftentimes cyber environments are different, and cyber defense greatly varies depending on the organization's infrastructures, right? You might have completely different infrastructure setups, applications, toolings, outsourced stuff, in-house things, teams. Some of them are like, some of you are probably a team of one. Some of you are probably a sophisticated team. Some of you are probably consultants. There's different ways how to learn. There's also, evolution. So what worked yesterday might be not working today, or we have to deal with all the applications that are being compromised, vulnerable, exploited constantly. We have to become experts investigating applications we've never seen before, infrastructures of clients, if you're a consultant, that we've never seen before. That's kind of tricky, but with hands-on training, there's the problem that also as a training provider here for us is that you can't just tell people what to do and then it's easy to just apply that. The biggest problem usually is also that you need to have an infrastructure that is already attacked so that you can actually investigate a compromise, right? Some realistic kind of hands-on course content and materials is kind of required, because otherwise it's tricky to learn. And that's not exactly like how it works for red teamers, for example, where you set up some servers, vulnerable settings, configurations, things like that, and you just basically hit the attack button and go in and have fun. Of course, there's sophisticated setups, of course, but I'm just saying with blue teamer, on the blue team side of things, you need to kind of have an attacked materials, contents, infrastructure first of all, and that's tricky, right? So we're doing our best to kind of help out on that end and share everything we can with you from a knowledge perspective and also in a hands-on training perspective, which you'll see, of course, later. But today we want to talk about cyber threats and important forensics concepts. Again, this is more a technical talk, so we'll do demos. We'll definitely show you some demos, but first we'll kick it off by exploring some, what does a cyber threat entail? It's not just phishing in the beginning, there's actually more to it. So we talk about some of just an overview of the techniques. We'll talk about forensic analysis concepts that we need to be familiar with in order to perform forensic investigation. Cyber threats. Just a quick overview. We've explored ransomware in depth last week, but so basically, what do we need to be prepared for? This is just me for a few minutes scanning the latest news, and 90% of it is another organization, ransomware, ADT, or a blood donation organization, or Indian companies, European companies, American companies, all getting hit with ransomware. An interesting one was a supply chain attack in terms of a Russian APT looking into exploiting TeamViewer so that they would actually be able to gain access to organizations through this supply chain attack. That was actually probably one of the very interesting highlights, other than ransomware everywhere. Tons of data records breached. So this is continue to happen, and we want to be prepared for this. Now, how can we prepare? Obviously, it's great if we have an understanding of what are the tactics and techniques that a threat actor is using. Now, they obviously try to use the latest and greatest and things that we can't find and detect so easily. But there is one place people might be familiar with, the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, where these attack tactics and techniques are being documented. Of course, this is not a conclusive kind of matrix which kind of documents all the tactics that are out there. It's just well-known ones, and usually it's pretty straightforward that you can actually map what you see in the real world into the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. For example, it describes what an attacker, kind of the kill chain, what an attacker goes through from initial access, or before initial access preparation, even reconnaissance, development, resource development, initial access, all the way to achieving the objectives, which is usually data exfiltration and ransomware execution, which is on the exfiltration and impact tactic. And within that, there's also several techniques of how this can be done, right? How you can exfiltrate data, how you can execute ransomware, things along those lines. Now, there is in between a lot of steps that it takes, right? And this is not like linear. It's basically depending on the environment and the threat actor. If they gain initial access to an environment, there's multiple ways to do so, right? It can be phishing, it can be drive-by downloads, it can be using a stolen account, anything along those lines. And then there is, actually see somebody's asking for a link to the to Discord. If somebody could maybe share the link to Discord, that would be great. Thank you. So basically, once a threat actor is in the environment, we can see that an attacker needs to perform a couple steps before they actually get all the way to the domain admin credentials they need in order to exfiltrate and steal data. They need to perform executing malicious scripts, binaries, tools, perform persistence so that they're not locked out as soon as they lose the access, for example. Ideally in a stealthy way, which is defense evasion, right? Like executing stuff that might be not visible to the defense controls and people in the SOC. And also, you need to gain credentials, usually stealing credentials, elevating privileges in order to be able to access the resources you need and move laterally to those resources and systems, then to collect the data, steal the data, things along those lines. Many techniques, and I would say it's actually pretty simple to ransomware cases, for example, to break them down into the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. And I've done that before, so I want to share it with you. This is, for example, a ransomware lifecycle where I basically put up the tactics. You would constantly see. We also discussed the ransomware lifecycle last week, but this is broken down by the tactics that you constantly see in a typical scenario. Now, some of the tools might change here and there, but overall, you always see, there's some initial access, most likely phishing, but in any case, as soon as there's an attack as a foothold in an environment, there's post-exploitation. We see persistence constantly with scheduled tasks, run keys, account creation, things along those lines. Discovery through living off the land tools, constantly like those, tools that admins would use to figure out which system are you on, what are your privileges, what are the neighbor privileges, neighbor systems around you, what account do you need in order to move there, can you steal any accounts, things along those lines. And then there's also, potentially privilege escalation required in order to access more sensitive systems, access further credentials, dumping credentials through the LSS processes, SAM hives, Mimikatz tools, then moving to systems, lateral movement techniques when you have stolen hashes or tickets, for example. That's why understanding credentials and authentication is important, Kerberos, NTLM, things along those lines. Defensive evasion, discovery through defensive evasion through process injection, oftentimes. Discovery, figuring out the environments, basically mapping them out by tools such as using tools such as ADFind. Another one is Bloodhound that you see a lot. And then command and control through the famous command and control frameworks such as Cobalt Strike, Empire, and Sliver. There's a few out there that are commonly used. So if you understand those, you can make your life much easier in terms of being able to detect and prevent those attacks. And then the impact is usually exfiltration of the data that they collected, and then execution of ransomware through the ransomware just spreading itself through some means of PSExec or other ways, PowerShell or group policies to spread the ransomware across all the hosts. And then exfiltration often is done through FTP tools, using 7-zip to archive it and then send it through an FTP tool or something like rclone to cloud storages and things along those lines. Most of the time, it's like very similar approaches there. But with that being said, this is like a very common way of how the techniques that are being carried out by attackers. Like, of course, we can dive deeper in order to talk about what tools specifically or techniques specifically they were using. Should we have been able to see it or not? First of all, you need visibility by the means of the right logging and other kinds of tools on there, so that it actually gets you the visibility you need to be able to even have a chance to detect things. And that's, we discussed those in more depth in like other courses, but that's a very important point here. Now, when it comes to investigating those things, we can, of course, focus on a few things, right? First of all, let's say we have a compromised system. We need to understand how we can analyze it. And this is what we covered last time. This is a refresher again here because we're gonna dive a little deeper in this now. Forensic analysis process starts with the collection, and I always keep saying this is the most important part, because if you mess up the collection, you have nothing to analyze. But also, if it takes too long, you also can lose a lot of, attackers can do a lot of damage, you can lose a lot of time, and this is not great either. So you need to understand how you can, in the best way possible, most effective way possible, collect the data you need to examine it, turn it into data, parse it, turn it into information, analyze it in order to then figure out what happened, turn it into evidence. And when you collect the data, you need to know that it's important that it's not as straightforward in a large enterprise environment to figure out what are the data sources you even need to know or need to have. Like, what are the data sources that might have captured traces for something you don't even know yet, really. Like, you might have an alert, but you don't exactly know what all the data sources are that you need in order to dive deeper, right? You might look into endpoints or firewall logs or any alerts by a tool that just threw an alert and with not much context. So you really need to first make a plan in terms of the data sources you need to look into. And then you follow the order of volatility, which means you start with collecting the most volatile data first, such as endpoints memory, for example, because that would be gone as soon as you shut them off. Then you look into, for example, disk images of an endpoint before you then focus on less volatile data, such as logs that might be stored somewhere and things along those lines. And then, of course, keeping in mind the chain of custody and verifying integrity. So basically, you document everything you did when somebody collected a data set, for example. You basically document who, when, where, how, and that needs to have like a bulletproof chain. So technically that it's going to be admissible in court. Most likely, in most cases, this is not going to be the case later, but just something to keep in mind. If that is going to be the case, there would be a huge problem otherwise. Once we have data collected, we look into data examination, right? We have to figure out, now we have some binary sources or data sets or disk images, memory images. What are we going to do with this bunch of logs? We need to process them. We need to assess, and we need to figure out the important information, the data that we can gain from this in order to turn it into information. And then we can start our analysis. And that's usually, for example, grabbing the most relevant Windows memory and disk artifacts so that we can quickly parse them with our forensics tools and following a standard process and procedure, so that we can basically figure out quickly what we need in a case that is time sensitive. And then we report it, we find the findings, basically put it in a timeline or into documents that are like, where we have recommendations for clients, for leadership, things along those lines. It depends on the case. In most cases, like a ransomware case, you have several images that you would look into, and you would have to create multiple timelines and merge those and figure out when something started, what is kind of patient zero, root cause analysis, things along those lines, and then also understanding all the systems on the way that might have been compromised, the accounts that might have been compromised, in order to perform proper containment and eradication. But speaking of understanding your data sources, this one is something that this image, was just a symbolic image, but basically should get you the idea that we have multiple data sources in an enterprise environment, right? We have, as a digital forensic analyst, an incident response expert, we need to kind of quickly understand what might have been compromised and how can we contain and then collect the data to analyze it to eradicate the threat. And that basically means we have to look into cloud environments. We might have to look into network logs. We might have to look into certain applications and services that might have been compromised. Web servers, very often the case. VPN services, things along those lines. We might have to look into domain controllers and endpoints. Windows is not always just as end user endpoint, but very likely things are often starting there, unless it's a vulnerability or something like started through VPN or compromised accounts. So digital forensics doesn't always include just looking into endpoints. You will have to correlate data from many different sources in order to make sense of it. And that's the trick oftentimes, right? We're not too familiar with the larger organization and the applications that are around, but we need to understand or quickly make recommendations in terms of what we need in order to perform the analysis. And in terms of a Windows system, this is something people that might have seen before. These are the most important components, some of high level, the sources that we are looking at when we perform forensic analysis on a Windows system. First, I already mentioned collecting in terms of order volatility. We want to collect the memory. There's a lot of important information in the memory. If we can grab that, that is great because that doesn't exist anywhere else. So we can see the processes that have run, the network connections that were active, and a ton of other things. So basically, that is our main kind of source if we can. But that also takes more time and also is more difficult to acquire. So that's not always possible. It's just a really high, it should be high on the list of consideration. But if you look into the disk, we have multiple options, right? We have a typical Windows system runs on a file system called the NTFS, the NTL file system. That tells us a lot if we know the artifacts to look at. That tells us a lot in terms of what the files might have been that might have been created, accessed, modified, deleted on the system. Then we also have Windows itself, with one of the main artifacts is the Windows registry. There's a lot of important stuff that is being logged based on just user activity and system settings. Then Windows event logs, basically recording a lot of events that are happening on a Windows system. Some of them are useful for security as well, for investigations. And then there's dozens of other Windows files and artifacts and databases and things like that on a Windows system that we can also use for forensic analysis to identify or to figure out what might have happened. And there's so many that some of them are more famous than others, but it also keeps changing slightly with new Windows versions. But for the last, like Windows 11, Windows 10, starting from Windows 7, things haven't changed too much. So the analysis process is very much the same, except of a few slight changes maybe in the artifacts, but common Windows knowledge and skills to understand how to analyze those artifacts quickly is definitely highly relevant. So when we start with data collection, I wanted to show you the Windows artifacts quickly because there is a few considerations and decisions we have to make. The first one is, do we need to collect really an entire system when we think a system is compromised? Or do we need to just collect the data sets that are important to us, such as the artifacts, like the ones I mentioned here? Do we just need the registry? Do we just need the event logs? Do we just need like 5 or 6 different artifacts to tell us about execution and persistence? Or do we really need to dive as deep as we can and spend a lot of time on the analysis? So that decision depends on the case. And so if we need to go quick or even at scale, we can perform a live data collection on the live running systems. We can collect volatile evidence and files without performing a lengthy drive duplication. So basically just grabbing those files from the systems as they are still running to then analyze them in our forensic lab. So this is, like I mentioned, great for data collection requirements at scale. And sometimes you need to collect from dozens of systems at the same time, ideally. So you can't just spend time for each system. You need to process them all at once. On the other hand, if there is a forensic duplication needed, for example, a disk image, such as imaging a disk, you would then go and think about how can you get the entire data, like a one bit by bit kind of copy of a disk image of a system from that particular endpoint. It might be a virtual machine, it might be a remote employee's workstation, it might be a server sitting somewhere. There's, definitely logistics you need to think about. But, when it comes to the system itself, we need to understand that there is systems might be still running or might be offline. So that might change the case. And then if we are going to want to create a forensically sound image of the disk, we can, for example, use something such a write blocker. We would extract the disk from a system and then use a write blocker to just read from that particular storage medium and create a disk image, such as, for example, a bit-by-bit copy or in a raw format, or EU1s, in-case evidence files are very common. AFF is also something you hear in the forensics world. So basically, that's a way to copy one by one, bit by bit, basically the information from a storage medium to the acquisition system. And there's a lot of things that you can then still figure out in terms of the image that you wouldn't be able to do with a quick data collection, for example. And for example, one of those things are that, trade-offs are that come with virtual machines is you have a disk image and a memory image still, but those disk images are expandable. So for example, a disk image is usually fixed size or dynamic, but if it's expandable and dynamic, it might grow in size as you put more data on it. You do not have a 500 gigabyte disk, for example, and then have also the non-allocated space of a disk available to see if there's maybe any deleted files on there, or maybe you can carve for files and recover those pre-existing files. That's not so much the case with virtual disk images. But you can also use some advantages, such as, taking snapshots, exporting snapshots, and then various disk images that are formats that are, compatible with forensics tools, such as the VMDK for VMware, VHD from the Microsoft disk images. VirtualBox can also export VHDs or using VDIs by default, though. Most of these images and file formats are compatible with forensics tools. And for memory images, one interesting part is that you can export from a hypervisor. So for example, if you're using VMware, you can export a file which represents basically the memory of a virtual machine. So that would, for example, be a vmem file, and also comes with a VMSS, and there might be saved state files if you pause a system, VMSN. So these are all important files that are interesting for analysis when it comes to, for example, VMware. And the same is for VirtualBox. You have ELF files. You have Hyper-V, you have bin files. So those are the memory flat files, which are really cool because you can actually just grab them and then analyze them with a tool such as volatility to perform memory forensics. And if we dive deeper, one thing we need to know before we perform analysis on a system, what does a hard drive consist of? So if you look into a hard disk, this is kind of what we need to understand in order to be able to find the right areas of a disk image. So if you have a full disk image, you basically start where the first few bytes are allocated to the master boot record. So basically the system trying to figure out the pointers to what operating system to load and so on. So, and then the second one here, we can see there's a partition and then there's another partition. So the part two is the first partition's boot sector, and the system can have one or multiple partitions. And the first partition boot sector is just basically this reserved space that tells the system, okay, this is how to start the operating system on this partition. And then on 3, you can see the file system area. So the file system related files that are stored here, such as the NTFS files, for example, on a partition. And then the rest of the partition here is the data area where data is being stored, where the Windows files are stored, the user files are stored, and this can be all over the place. And basically fragmented or not, but this is where you can find the data. And then there might be one or more partitions on the same system, and everything repeats again with partition boot sectors and so on. But really important for us, it's to understand is that there's a hard drive, and there can be one or multiple partitions, and within the partitions you have a Windows, for example, operating system. And speaking of the file system, the operating system sits on a file system. The underlying file system basically for Windows is NTFS. And NTFS, here's similar image again as we just covered. You have Windows using NTFS for basically managing files that are being created, accessed, modified, deleted on a system. Windows doesn't really do that itself. It uses the NTFS. It's been like that for over 20 years now. And the NTFS comes with a number of advantages, such as journaling, shadow copies, compression, things along those lines. But obviously, to do so, it also needs a couple of additional files so that, records and data is being stored and it knows what to do. And some of those are really important for forensics, such as the MFT file, the log file, USN journal. So these are all files that are tracking evidence of existing files and folders, for example. So we are going to explore the MFT a little further because this is one of the first things that you would do in forensics and also when it comes to analysis of files. So for example, an MFT file is basically a record, is basically keeping records in a list of every single folder or file that exists on a Windows system. So here you can see this is one record out of many as it is stored in the MFT. The master file table has many records, each one in 1024 bytes of size. And this is basically what describes each individual file on a system. It starts with a header, some header information, and then it can have one or more attributes before the rest of this area is reserved for data. And those attributes here have information such as timestamps and file names, things along those lines, and we'll explore those a little later. But it's important to know that this is what a record would look like. And that's one of the main fundamental concepts for forensic analysts, especially when it comes to Windows and NTFS. So let's dive into it live. I'd say it's probably a good place to just get hands-on. We only have a few, like 20 minutes or so left. If you want to follow a guide, I highly recommend, we've put a cheat sheet out there for which relates to our Practical Windows Forensics course, but all the steps that we are talking about today and probably many, many, many more are all covered in a cheat sheet that is out here that you can use for free by yourself to conduct forensic investigations. It's all based on Windows, and it tells you all the different ways of how, places, artifacts in a Windows system that you need to know in order to, first of all, conduct the course, but it covers like a good majority of artifacts that are known and that are important out there. So I'm gonna post that just real quick in the chat. And the other thing you can see here, yeah, this is the TCM forensics course. The PWF stands for Practical Windows Forensics. So there's this cheat sheet. It's out there for free. And you can basically use that for your analysis, to guide your analysis. In order to perform analysis, you can find a link here where you can find recommendations on how to set up a forensic workstation. We'll look more into tools next week, but there's just a few tools that are really low-hanging fruit that are more open source or free that I highly recommend to be using for Windows forensics. So let's jump in our case for the last 20 minutes. Let's say we have, and this is along the lines of the Practical Windows Forensics. You've seen that before. It might be a refresher, but there's a lot of people that have not done or seen or gone through this course. So we want to kick it off simple with some basics in terms of what to look for in a Windows system. Our case is that we have a file called art-attack.ps1, and it was used on an employee's Windows 10 system to execute some malicious attack techniques afterwards. Now, the goal is to analyze what happened, right? Malicious files, execution, persistence, anything that we typically would look for in an investigation very quickly. And we have disk and memory images. Now we'll only get to the disk today, of course, but because there's not too much time, but that basically sets the stage. Let me start my forensics VM. So bear with me one sec. Shouldn't have done that, but now here it is. So this is our Windows system. Here's the Discord link. We have tools on there and we have evidence files on there, right? And the first thing that we want to know, that we want to do is we want to understand the evidence that we are dealing with. And for this, we need to use tools to look into the evidence. And so we have our cases folder, we have the disk image, and we need to find a way how we can look into the disk image. And one way to do so is a tool called FTK Imager. And I'm going through this a little faster here because it might take a few seconds to load. If you do it live, just takes a while. So this is a great tool. You can mount or you can explore disk images, but you can also use it for creating disk images and memory images of a system. So here there's, for example, options up there where it says you can create a memory image of the system and you can create a disk image of the system that we are on right now. Or you can load images, such as, if you look in our case, we have a disk image right here. And this VHD is now loaded. This is what we collected from our employee who was, looking at some malicious signs probably on the system. We have loaded it up. We have loaded the VHD. It consists of one partition. It has a Windows NTFS system on there. And in the root of this NTFS, we have all these files. And this is what you typically see in a Windows environment. You can see, or actually what you see on a disk image. Windows does not show you all these kind of things. If we compare this with what Windows would show to a user on a C drive, that's basically it, including hidden files, right? So we don't see anything other than Windows-related relevant files. But really, what's going on a Windows on a hard disk that has NTFS and Windows installed, you would have all these files available, and those are important. And the ones with the $signs in the beginning are NTFS related. And you can already see there's the $MFT, which we've been talking about. So we want to look into that one. And then, of course, there's ways how we can extract this data. We can do right-click, export file, one by one to get all the artifacts we need that we just talked about. Or you can use tools such as, if you have done the Windows Forensics course, you're familiar with CAPE, for example. This is a parser that would extract all the files that are relevant for a particular forensic investigation quickly at one go, so that you then end up with a triage collection. And the triage collection is basically the relevant files collected in something like this. So we still have the original disk structure preserved, but only with the files that we want for analysis. And obviously that would now be much more easier to process, because that is only 400 megabytes in size, as opposed to dealing with a disk image that is 15 gigabytes and more. So now we just want to look into, let's say, the MFT. For this, we can use our tools. So we have some tools on this system, and we have our Windows triage collection. The tools we can use is, we have just used FTK to mount it. We can use Arsenal Imager as well to mount it. There's some advantages over that. And then for analysis, we can use some other tools, and the most important ones are the Eric Zimmerman tools. I'm going to post a link to these tools in a little bit, but basically Eric Zimmerman is a person that is affiliated with Kroll and SANS and built all these tools, each tool to solve an individual problem, which is parsing an individual kind of artifact. So if we want to, for example, run a tool to parse the MFT, we need to look into the MFT, look into a tool that can parse the MFT. And there is an MFT cmd.exe. And this one is basically very simple. We need to go to the directory and then just say MFT. Thanks, Ben, for posting the link to the Eric Zimmerman tools. Everyone in the forensic industry is familiar with Eric Zimmerman tools, I think or hope. So if you run mft.exe, you can basically just see the examples and say -f points to an MFT, and then we can parse it and dump the information into a CSV file so we can read it. And that's really cool, because if we do just that, we can then see the files that were on the system. So let's say I want to collect those files and I want to put them into a CSV. Or I want to put the information in a CSV right here. It is going to process 128,000 records on this MFT. In this particular case, that means we had over 100,000 files on the directories stored on the system, which were recorded by the MFT. And so the MFT was like 125 megabyte in size. Now we created an output, and which ended up, I think, right here. Shouldn't have done it right there, but basically I put it in cases. So this is the CSV output. In order to look to see on CSVs, obviously we can use Excel, or Eric Zimmerman has a tool called the Timeline Explorer. And that's also a fun one because that actually is really good for processing large CSVs. And in that CSV, we can just basically drop, in that tool, we can drop in the CSV. And then from there, we remember we had a file called art-attack.csv. So now we can see, hey, is it even still on the system? We could have maybe navigated through this file directory now where we mounted an FTK, or we could have just searched DMFT. So this is the MFT output, and it has a every entry is a row. And you can see that the first entry in the MFT is basically pointing to the MFT itself. There's an MFT mirror, then you see a bunch of $ files. So it points to all the NTFS related files before at some point you can see there's Windows files showing up. These are the directories. These are the file names. And then we have, like we said, 125,000 of these entries. So these are all the files on this hard disk. And we can quickly just search and see and hope that this file is still known and available in the MFT. So if I just type attack, we can see all the file and paths and names that were that match the attack term. And now we can see that this ART attack.ps1 file exists on the system within the iUser desktop PWF folder. And that means now we can explore it further. You can also see that this record also kept track of timestamps. There's 8 timestamps and the file size associated with this entry. We can even see when it was created and when it was modified. And we have 8 different ones. There's a reason for this, and we're going to look into this in a second. The one thing we need to know is that there's an entry number. So there's this entry number that identifies this file within the MFT. So let's look closer into this file itself using the parser, the Eric Zimmerman MFT parser. We can just say --de, which is dump the details of just one particular entry. And this is the 84 entry. So say 84.925. And in that case now, we want to get all the information about this particular entry itself, which we have here. And I think that is pretty cool because that now means that we are going to learn a lot about how file systems and NTFS and MFT records work. And this is important to understand when a file was created, when it was modified, when it was accessed, if it was deleted or not. This goes a long way here. So here's where we started. We have the output, and then it dumps the details. And if you remember the record that we explored earlier in the PDF, in the PowerPoint, we know that there's headers and then there's attributes. So in the header, we can see the most important information. I'm going quick here because we don't have too much time left. The most important information is that there's a flag that says it's in use. So that means the file still exists on the system. If you delete a file on a system, however, it would not delete the file on the disk. It would not delete the file on the MFT record. It would simply just set the flag as not in use. So that means that basically the next file is being created on the system might or might not overwrite this entry, and then it's gone on the MFT, and might or might not overwrite the data of the file somewhere on the disk later on. So if you have fragments of files, those are allocated as not in use anymore, those are getting overwritten at any point in time later on, but there's always a chance that you could recover pieces of files or entire files on a disk, even though they have been deleted. But in our case, this flag means this file is still in use on the system. And then we have timestamps with it, which is basically says the standard info time, which is an attribute which is always on every file, associated with every file. And then we have one or more file name attributes. And then there's the data attribute. So the standard info file attribute is really important because that one actually has the timestamps that Windows basically reads and writes to. And so what that means is that, first of all, Windows was saying that this file was created on March 17, 2022, 23:35 o'clock. And then it was record modified on actually an hour later about, and then it was last accessed an hour later. Now, this is a little tricky because this record modified means the record on the MFT was modified right here. And this is usually a sign of when it was created. But the actual file itself was created an hour before. And that is a sign that it might actually have been created on a different system. So those file timestamps might have, this is speculation, but probably a likely chance that it was actually created somewhere else. And those timestamps are inherited. So inherited, this is when the file was created. This is when you see malware and you see created on and modified on was before it landed on a disk, for example. This could be that it actually was compiled before somewhere else, before it landed on the disk. But this is the record that we need in order to understand when it really was created on our system here, which is when the MFT record for it was created. And then you can see when it was last accessed on top of this as well. Now there's some implications with this, but still it was last accessed 3 minutes after it was, the record was modified and basically created on the system. So that means it landed on the disk, it was executed, and it was probably compiled before that. Now, that has some interesting, tells an interesting story, right? We can already timeline kind of see on a timeline when something happened. And with the file name attribute though, there's two. One of them is for the DOS name type. So this is where you can see the file name like in a short kind of version, the DOS version. And then there's another one which basically just contains the file name as we see it in Windows. This is the Windows friendly file name, ART attack PS1. And then the file name attributes do not usually get overwritten by Windows, not touched by Windows. Those are just being stored as, as it is when it was created on this disk and don't change. So that's why this one actually, they have all the same file timestamps and it matches with the record modified on timestamp. That means very likely this file was created on our system based on what the file name attribute is telling us, based on what the record modified attribute timestamp is telling us too. Only the other ones, these are the ones that Windows have been overwritten by Windows or other operating systems. And then finally, we have the data attribute, and that one is basically storing the data, the payload, the content of this particular file. And remember, there's a 1024 byte size record size on the MFT for each record. Of course, most files don't fit in this record. So the data attribute here basically means that is non-resident. Somebody already called out, yep, non-resident data, that's right. We have a flag in the data attribute header saying that it's non-resident. That means we need to look for the content of this file somewhere else, not within the record on the MFT itself. A small file payload would actually be stored right in the MFT record. Since it's larger, it doesn't fit in there. We have entries across, we could have entries across the entire disk. That means the file might have been fragmented. Some pieces of the file might be here, some over there in different clusters. And those clusters are being kept track of in here. So this is the actual offset where we can find the content of this file. Now we only have one. So this file is basically, the entire content of this file is stored starting at this offset. And there's also the number of classes that are being used and the actual file size you can see here in hex. But basically, if you have a large file, there might be multiple data runs. And this is how Windows basically tells the NTFS if it needs a file, hey, give me the content of the file. And the NTFS is basically telling Windows, hey, here is actually the locations of the file, put it together and present it to the user. Now, that's the first deeper dive into the NTFS and MFT and how you can actually understand how files are being created, changed, modified, and what this means, especially, and this thing is really interesting when it comes to malware, right? You need to understand that. When was it created? Was it created outside of the system or here? When you, for example, unzip a file, oftentimes files within the zip file inherit the timestamps that they got from whenever an attacker built them somewhere else, for example. So you always know when they were built somewhere else first. Other than, well, sometimes you can copy files on a system, move files on a system, and that would also change the timestamps. And the one resource I wanted to show you on that is that you can actually get those, what the meanings of those file timestamps on multiple sources. One website here is a really good one. The modified access, created and birth times of Windows forensic, of Windows files, of NTFS files, basically, the ones we just looked at. And this here is basically a write-up on, also includes some sans information, of course, what the timestamps means in terms of what happened to the file. It could be a file rename, then there's only one file timestamp that might change. When a file gets created, all the files get changed, all the timestamps get changed. When a file gets copied, only access, creation, and metadata timestamps get changed. So this is a really good one, and I'm just going quick here, but this is a really good one to keep in mind when it comes to understanding how a file got on a system. Was it copied? Was it created? Was it modified? Was it moved from a volume or from a local location? Things along those lines. I can post the tools that I was using and the timestamp information here as well. Put it in Zoom, put it in the chat. And since we're running out of time, all I have left for you is what we're going to cover today is basically the important forensic concepts. Just one NTFS was basically what we got into, but there is, as you can see in Windows, there's a lot of other locations. So we need to be familiar with those because there's essential tools and applications that we're going to cover next week, which is really cool because we're going to talk about entire lab environments, not just the individual applications, and what they can do for us, and the ones that work and didn't work for my career, basically, and how we can effectively build investigation labs. And that's really cool. I like automation, so definitely excited about that one.